If your prayer brings rain, the farm will be yours." The wealthy farmer mocked, but the next day, Mrs. Esther Miller knelt on the cracked earth that was once her family's pride, her hands trembling not just from her 72 years, but from the despair of someone about to lose everything. For 5 years since becoming a widow, she had fought alone to keep the small property inherited from her husband running. But the devastating drought of the last 2 years had destroyed any hope of financial recovery. That's when Silas Blackstone, the richest man in the county and owner of thousands of acres surrounding her small farm, appeared with a proposal that sounded like a sentence. He knew every penny of debt she had at the bank and offered a ridiculous sum for the property, knowing she had no choice. "You're being stubborn, Mrs. Esther," said Silas, adjusting his hat as he looked disdainfully at the dry land. "Accept my offer now and you can still leave here with some money in your pocket." Esther lifted her eyes from the ground where she had knelt and stared at the man who had terrorized the small producers in the county for decades. Her voice came out firm, contradicting the tremor in her hands. "This land has belonged to my family for 3 generations, Mr. Silas. I won't sell it for anything." "And how do you plan to pay your debts?" he asked with a cruel smile. "The bank has already contacted me. You have until the end of the month to settle everything or they foreclose on the mortgage. And guess who will be there to buy at the auction?" Esther's heart raced. She knew her debts were high, but she hadn't imagined Silas was already involved in the situation. Her savings had run out in the desperate attempt to save the last harvest, which was also lost due to the lack of rain. "I'll get the money," she lied, knowing there was no hope left. Silas laughed scornfully, a sound that echoed through the empty property like an omen of defeat. It was then that something inside Esther ignited, a mix of unshakable faith and the stubbornness her mother always said would be her ruin. "You know what, Mr. Silas? If it rains in the next 24 hours, you leave my property alone forever." The man stopped laughing and stared at her with interest, as if facing a child throwing a tantrum. "And if it doesn't rain?" "I'll sign the deed of sale right now for whatever price you want." Silas looked at the completely clear sky, without a single cloud on the horizon. The meteorologists had predicted 15 more days of scorching sun, and he had privileged access to this information through contacts at the Regional Climate Research Center. "You're proposing to bet your farm on a prayer?" he asked, barely able to contain his amusement. "That's exactly what I'm doing. And if I accept this crazy bet?" "If it rains, you leave me alone and never set foot on this land again. If it doesn't rain by tomorrow at the same time, I'll sign any paper you bring." Silas extended his hand, certain he was facing the easiest victory of his life. Esther shook that hand without hesitation, sealing a deal that would change the fate of everyone involved. "Exactly 24 hours, he confirmed, looking at his watch. "It's 3 in the afternoon. Until tomorrow at 3, no exceptions." After Silas left in his high-end pickup truck, leaving a cloud of red dust in the dry air, Esther knelt on the earth again. This time, however, her prayer had a defined deadline and consequences she preferred not to imagine. As the sun set on the orange horizon, painting the cloudless sky with fiery hues, Esther remained kneeling in the same place. Her words whispered to the wind seemed to get lost in the dry vastness that stretched as far as the eye could see. She had grown up on that land, married in the small chapel her grandfather had built with his own hands, raised her children breathing in the scent of damp earth after the rain. She couldn't imagine a life away from there. In the early morning hours, as the temperature finally offered a break from the day's scorching heat, Esther continued her vigil. Her legs were already numb, but she didn't move. At 72, she had been through droughts before, but never one that had lasted this long. Her late husband, Arthur Miller, always said the land had a memory, that it knew when it was loved and repaid that love with generosity. Esther hoped the land's memory was longer than Silas Blackstone's stubbornness. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. When the first ray of sunlight touched her weary face, Esther finally stood up. Her joints protested with small cracks, reminding her she was no longer 20 years old to spend the whole night kneeling on the hard ground. She looked at the morning sky, still completely blue and without the slightest evidence that climate changes were on the way. It was then that she heard the sound of a car approaching on the dirt road. For a moment, her heart filled with hope, thinking it might be Silas coming to cancel the crazy bet. But she soon recognized the sound of the old engine of her daughter, Heather Bennett's old blue Beetle. Heather got out of the car in a hurry, her red eyes betraying a sleepless night. At 45, she had inherited her mother's stubbornness, but also a practicality that sometimes clashed with Esther's unshakable faith. "Mother, for God's sake, what have you done?" asked Heather, running toward her mother. "The whole city already knows about your bet with Silas Blackstone. And how did you find out?" "Wayne told me. He heard it at the bar where he works." "Mother, have you completely lost your mind?" Esther straightened the purple blouse she had worn throughout the vigil. Wayne was Heather's husband, a hard-working young man who had always been kind to her, but who worked in the city and understood little about rural life. "I haven't lost my mind at all, my daughter. I just trusted in something greater than the wickedness of this world. But Mother betting the farm on a prayer. What if it doesn't rain?" "If it doesn't rain, then this was no longer my place," Esther replied, with a serenity that contrasted with the desperation in her eyes. Heather held her mother's hands, feeling the roughness from decades of working the land. She had moved to the city after getting married, following her husband's dream of a more stable life in commerce, but she had always felt she had abandoned her roots. Seeing her mother in that desperate situation awakened a guilt she had carried for years. "You're not alone in this, Mother. If we can get a loan—" "With what collateral, daughter? This land is all I have, and it's already tied up with the bank. There's nothing more we can do but trust. What about Wayne? He has some savings." "I will not take money from my son-in-law to pay my debts," Esther said firmly. "I raised you all with my head held high. I won't bow my head now." The two women spent the morning in silence, each lost in her own thoughts. Heather tried to find a practical solution to the problem, while Esther kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for signs of a change in the weather that stubbornly remained stable. Around noon, when the sun was already punishing the cracked earth again, Wayne arrived driving a borrowed high-end pickup truck. He got out of the vehicle with a worried expression that immediately caught the attention of the two women. "Good morning, Mrs. Esther. Heather," he greeted, taking off his cap to show respect. "Good morning, son," replied Esther. "Thank you for looking after my daughter." Wayne approached, visibly uncomfortable. At 38, he had grown up in the same county, but his family had always worked in the city's commerce. He understood little about farming, but he knew a lot about the questionable methods Silas Blackstone used to expand his holdings. "Mrs. Esther, I need to tell you something important." The seriousness in his voice made Esther and Heather look at each other with apprehension. "Go ahead, Wayne." "It's about Silas Blackstone and his debts at the bank. Yesterday, when I heard about the bet, I decided to investigate a bit. I have a friend who works at the county clerk's office, and he told me that Silas bought up all his debts from the bank 3 weeks ago." Esther's blood ran cold. Heather brought her hand to her mouth, stifling a cry of indignation. "What do you mean, bought?" "The bank was having liquidity problems and offered the debt securities to investors. Silas bought not only yours, but also those of 5 other small producers in the county. Now he's the one who decides whether to accept installments, renegotiation, or to foreclose immediately. That means that he already knew you couldn't pay when he made the bet. He was just toying with you, knowing that, rain or not, he could foreclose whenever he wanted." The revelation hit them like a bucket of cold water. Esther felt her legs weaken and had to lean on her daughter's arm. The manipulation was even worse than she had imagined. "There's more," continued Wayne hesitantly. "My friend at the county clerk said Silas already has the papers ready to register the property in his name. He's so confident it won't rain that he's had everything prepared already." "Damn him," murmured Heather through clenched teeth. "No, daughter," interrupted Esther, regaining her composure. "We won't stoop to his level. If he wants to play with other people's misfortune, that's his problem. My bet still stands." Wayne looked at the completely blue sky, and then at the woman he admired for her strength and dignity. "Mrs. Esther, with all due respect, but there isn't a cloud on the horizon. The Weather Institute said this dry air mass will remain for at least 2 more weeks. And since when is the Weather Institute more powerful than the faith of a woman who has worked this land her whole life?" The conviction in Esther's voice was such that for a moment Wayne almost believed she could be right. Heather, for her part, felt torn between admiration for her mother's strength and frustration at what seemed like self-destructive stubbornness. "Mother, please, be reasonable. There's still time to talk to Silas. Explain that we discovered the manipulation. And what would that change, daughter? He holds the titles legally. He can foreclose whenever he wants, regardless of our bet. Then why keep up this charade? Because sometimes the charade is the only thing we have left to maintain our dignity." The hours passed slowly under the scorching sun. Wayne returned to the city, promising to try to find some legal loophole, while Heather insisted on staying by her mother's side during what could be their last hours on the property. At 2 in the afternoon, 1 hour before the set deadline, Silas Blackstone returned to the property. This time, he did not come alone. A man in a suit accompanied him, carrying a briefcase of documents that left no doubt about his intentions. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Esther," greeted Silas with false cordiality. "I brought my lawyer here, Attorney Marshall, to expedite the deed transfer as soon as the deadline passes." "Good afternoon," Esther replied curtly. "I see you spent the night praying. I admire your dedication, even knowing it was in vain." "We still have an hour," she reminded him, looking directly into the man's eyes. "That's true. 1 hour for a miracle, that won't happen." The lawyer, a thin, middle-aged man, seemed uncomfortable with the situation. He had met Esther years ago when he was still a young attorney, trying to build a career in the small town. She had been one of the first people to trust him with legal matters concerning the property, and he had always respected that family's dignity. "Silas, perhaps we can discuss more favorable terms for the lady," Attorney Marshall suggested discreetly. "The terms were already agreed upon yesterday, Attorney. The lady bet her farm on a prayer. If it doesn't rain in the next—" Silas looked at the gold watch on his wrist. 58 minutes she signs the transfer. It was at that moment that something unexpected happened. A gentle breeze began to blow across the property, moving the red dust in little whirlwinds. Esther closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling a subtle change in the quality of the air. "Do you feel that?" she asked Heather. "What, Mother?" "The wind changed direction." Silas looked around irritably, as if that breeze were a personal affront. "Wind isn't rain, Mrs. Esther." "Not yet," she replied, kneeling back down on the earth. The minutes dragged on like hours. Silas paced nervously around the property, checking his watch every few minutes. The lawyer organized and reorganized the documents in his briefcase, while Heather held her mother's hand in silence. At 2:45, 15 minutes before the final deadline, a small shadow passed over them. Everyone looked up at the sky simultaneously and saw a single small white cloud forming on the horizon. "One cloud doesn't make a summer," said Silas, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "And a prayer doesn't make a miracle?" questioned Esther, without taking her eyes off the sky. In a matter of minutes, that small, lonely cloud began to grow and darken. Other clouds appeared seemingly out of nowhere, gathering at a speed that defied any conventional meteorological explanation. At 2:55, 5 minutes before the deadline, the sky was completely covered by dark, threatening clouds. A distant thunderclap echoed across the landscape, making Silas take an involuntary step back. "This is impossible," he murmured, taking his cell phone from his pocket to check the weather forecast. "For God, nothing is impossible," replied Esther, still kneeling, but now with tears streaming down her face. At 2:59, a thick, heavy drop fell right on Silas Blackstone's forehead, then another, and another. Within seconds, a heavy, abundant rain began to fall on the property, soaking the dry earth that had waited months for that moment. Silas looked at his watch. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. "Impossible," he repeated, but his voice was almost drowned out by the sound of the intensifying rain. Esther rose slowly, letting the water wash her face and her tears of gratitude. Heather hugged her, crying too, as they both smelled the wet earth whose scent had not perfumed the air for so long. "It seems our bet has come to an end, Mr. Silas," said Esther, her voice firm despite the emotion. The lawyer quickly put the documents back in his briefcase, protecting them from the now torrential rain. Silas remained motionless for a few seconds, as if he couldn't process what was happening. This can't be a coincidence, he stammered. Coincidence or not, the rain arrived within the agreed-upon time. You promised that if it rained, you would leave my property alone forever. The rain continued heavily, quickly turning the red dust into small puddles of mud. The sound of water hitting the dry leaves of the trees created a symphony that Esther hadn't heard in 2 years. Silas looked around, completely drenched, his arrogance replaced by an expression of disbelief and contained anger. He had invested a lot of money in buying the debts and had already made specific plans for that land. "This isn't over here," he said through clenched teeth. "Of course it is," interrupted the attorney, surprising everyone. "You made a public bet, with witnesses. The rain came within the established time. Legally, there's nothing more that can be done. Attorney Marshall, you work for me. And my job is to give correct legal advice, not to support breaking agreements." The bet was clear, and the lady won. Silas looked at the attorney with a mixture of incredulity and fury, realizing he was losing control of the situation in a way he had never experienced. "Let's go," he said abruptly, walking toward the high-end pickup truck. Before getting into the vehicle, he turned one last time to Esther. "Enjoy your victory, Mrs. Esther, but remember, I still hold the titles to your debts. This rain won't pay what you owe me." "If you are truly a man of your word, you'll tear up those titles right now," she replied firmly. "Our bet was about leaving your property alone if it rained. It said nothing about forgiving debts." The attorney cleared his throat discreetly. "Actually, Silas, technically..." "Technically what?" he interrupted brusquely. "If we analyze yesterday's conversation, when the lady said you would leave the property alone forever, that implies not taking actions to remove her from here. Executing the debts would be exactly that." Silas stared at the attorney as if he wanted to fire him on the spot, but he knew Attorney Marshall was correct. The legal interpretation of the bet could indeed include suspending debt foreclosures. "We'll discuss this at the office," he finally said, getting into the pickup truck. After they left, mother and daughter remained embraced under the heavy rain, feeling a mixture of relief, gratitude, and apprehension about what might come next. "Mom, you may have won this battle, but he won't give up easily," said Heather, shouting a little to be heard over the noise of the rain. "I know, daughter, but today God showed me I'm not alone in this fight." They ran to the small farmhouse where Esther kept memories of an entire lifetime. The rain continued all afternoon and night, filling the dry ponds and giving new life to the vegetation that had bravely withstood the months of drought. The next morning, when the sun finally reappeared among the clouds still drifting across the sky, Esther woke up early and went out to see the results of the miraculous rain. The transformation of the property was impressive. The land that yesterday was cracked and dead now displayed small green sprouts emerging from the wet mud. Wayne arrived early, still processing the news of what had happened the day before. He brought information he had gathered in the city overnight. "Mrs. Esther, you've become a legend in the city," he said, smiling for the first time in days. "Everyone is talking about your prayer and the rain that came at the exact time." "And Silas?" "Oh, he spent the night at the bar, drinking and complaining that he was cheated. He's saying he'll hire a meteorologist to investigate if it was really a coincidence." Esther laughed, the first genuine laugh she had had in months. "He can hire as many meteorologists as he wants. The rain came, and that's what matters." "There's something else," continued Wayne, growing more serious. "I spoke with my friend at the county clerk's office, and he said other small farmers who had their debts bought by Silas want to talk to you." "About what?" "They want to know how to get the same legal protection you did. It seems that Silas's lawyer, this Attorney Marshall, is questioning all the debt foreclosures that didn't follow proper procedures." The news brought a new dimension to the situation. Esther realized that her gamble hadn't just saved her property, but possibly set a precedent for other small farmers in the county. During the morning, 3 neighbors showed up at the property. They were people she had known for decades, but who had avoided contact for months, ashamed of their own financial troubles. "Mrs. Esther," said John Perkins, a 60-year-old man who raised cattle on a neighboring property, "did you really manage to make Silas back down?" "It wasn't me, John. It was the rain that came at the right time. But you were the one who had the courage to gamble when the rest of us had already given up. Mary Sanders, a 55-year-old vegetable farmer, nervously held her straw hat in her hands. "Mrs. Esther, do you think you could give us some advice? Silas bought our debts too, and we're desperate." Esther looked at those faces marked by work and worry. They were good, hard-working people who had always cared for their land with love and dedication. Seeing the fear in their eyes stirred in her an indignation that surpassed her own concerns. "Come, let's sit on the porch and talk properly." For the next 2 hours, Esther heard stories similar to her own. Lost harvests, broken equipment, accumulated debts, and always Silas Blackstone appearing with offers too good to refuse to buy the properties for a pittance. "What bothers me," said Charles Owens, the third neighbor present, "is that our problems all started more or less around the same time. Could that really be a coincidence?" Charles's observation made everyone reflect. Indeed, it seemed strange that so many small farmers in the county were facing similar difficulties simultaneously, especially considering they had always managed to overcome previous droughts. "Charles is right," agreed John. "My tractor broke down out of nowhere 6 months ago, right at planting time. The mechanic said someone had put sand in the oil. And my artesian well dried up overnight," added Mary. "The technician who came to check said it looked like someone had blocked the water veins." Esther felt a shiver run down her spine. She had attributed her difficulties to the drought and bad luck, but now she began to suspect there might be something more sinister behind all their problems. "We need to investigate this," she said with determination. "If Silas is sabotaging our properties to then buy them cheap, that's a crime." "But who will believe us?" asked Mary with discouragement. "He's the most powerful man in the county." "Attorney Marshall seemed honest yesterday," reminded Wayne, who'd been listening to the conversation in silence. "Maybe he can help us investigate." The informal meeting on Esther's porch turned into a sort of war council. For the first time in months, those small farmers felt they were not alone in their struggles. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we are just starting out, now continuing. 2 weeks after the miraculous rain, things began to get complicated in an unexpected way. Esther had planted her seeds in the renewed soil, and the first sprouts were already showing promising signs, but Silas Blackstone had not given up on his plans. On a Thursday morning, Wayne arrived at the property earlier than usual, wearing a worried expression that immediately alerted Esther. "Mrs. Esther, we have a problem," he said, quickly getting out of the car. "What is it now?" "Silas hired a law firm from Chicago. They're claiming our interpretation of the bet was wrong, and that he still has the right to collect on the debts." Esther felt her blood run cold. She had spent the last weeks believing her fight was over, pouring all her energy into recovering the property. Wrong how? They're saying the bet was only about not pursuing the voluntary sale of the property. The debts are a separate legal matter which wasn't included in the verbal agreement. But Attorney Marshall said, "Yeah, that's another problem. Attorney Marshall was fired. Silas is furious with him for advising against the firm's interests." Heather, who had arrived a few minutes before Wayne, sank heavily into a chair on the porch. "You mean everything we went through was for nothing?" "Not necessarily," said Wayne, trying to keep optimism in his voice. "I spoke with Attorney Marshall yesterday. He wants to help us, but now as an independent lawyer." "And do we have money to pay an independent lawyer?" asked Esther pragmatically. "He said he'd take the case pro bono, no charge. It seems he's ashamed of having worked for Silas for so many years without questioning his methods." The news brought a moment of relief, but Esther knew facing a law firm from Chicago would be far more complicated than dealing with Silas's direct intimidation. "Is there anything else?" Wayne hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he needed to say next. "Yes, there is, and it's not good news." "Go ahead, son." "Silas has spread the word that you have connections with meteorologists and that the rain wasn't a coincidence. He's trying to invalidate the bet by claiming there was cheating." "Cheating?" exclaimed Heather. "What cheating?" "My mother spent the whole night kneeling in the dirt, praying. I know that, and you know that. But Silas is hiring people to say they saw you talking with technicians from the Climate Research Center before the bet." Esther felt a mix of outrage and disbelief. The idea that her sincere faith could be twisted into an alleged fraud was more painful than any financial threat. And are people believing this? Some people, yes, mainly those who are afraid of Silas or depend on him in some way. What kind of people? Workers from his properties, suppliers, some merchants in the city. He has a lot of economic power, and people fear retaliation if they don't support his version. The revelation showed Esther a side of human nature she'd rather not have known. For decades, she had believed the truth would always prevail, but now she was discovering that even truth could be manipulated when enough power and money were involved. What does Attorney Marshall think we should do? He wants to meet with all of you this afternoon. He said he has a strategy, but he needs the cooperation of the whole group of small farmers. What strategy? He didn't want to discuss it over the phone. He only said he discovered something interesting in the office files before he was fired. The meeting was set for 4 in the afternoon at Esther's house. Besides the neighbors who had gathered before, 3 more small farmers who'd also had their debts bought by Silas showed up. Attorney Marshall arrived promptly, driving a modest car that contrasted with the luxury sedan he used to drive when working for Silas. At 45, he looked younger and lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for trusting me after all that's happened. Attorney Marshall, said Esther, you have a family to support. Are you sure you want to get involved against Silas? Mrs. Esther, I worked for that man for 15 years, and only now am I realizing how much wrong I did in the name of legality. If I don't do what's right now, I won't be able to look at myself in the mirror for the rest of my life. He opened a modest folder, very different from the luxurious leather briefcase he carried when he worked for Silas. Before being fired, I managed to make copies of some documents you need to see. The first document he showed was correspondence between Silas and a private meteorology company, dated 3 months before Esther's bet. Look at this, said Attorney Marshall, pointing to specific paragraphs. Silas hired this company to provide detailed forecasts about the county's weather patterns for the next 6 months. John Perkins adjusted his glasses to read better. And what does that mean? It means he knew exactly when it would rain before making the bet with Mrs. Esther. Look at the date of this specific forecast. The document showed a weather forecast indicating the possibility of isolated rains exactly during the period the bet was made. The forecast had been prepared using advanced climate models that were not available to the general public. So he knew it would rain? Asked Heather with disbelief. Not only did he know he was counting on it, replied the lawyer. Look at this other document. The second paper was an architectural plan for a grain distribution center to be built exactly where Esther's and her neighbors' properties were. This project was commissioned 4 months ago, long before any bet. Silas was already planning to use this land for a commercial venture. But why would he make the bet if he knew he would lose? Asked Charles. Because he didn't expect to lose, explained Attorney Marshall. Look at this third document. The last paper was even more revealing. It was a contract with a climate engineering company specialized in cloud dispersal and weather modification. Weather modification? Repeated Mary with astonishment. That exists? Yes, it does. It's an expensive technology, but real. Special planes spread chemicals in the clouds to prevent them from forming or to disperse them before they produce rain. And Silas hired this? Exactly. He hired this company to ensure it wouldn't rain during the bet period, even knowing there was a forecast for natural rain. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the wind in the leaves of the century-old mango tree in Esther's backyard. The revelation was so absurd that no one knew how to react initially. So he was, began Esther. Sabotaged by his own sabotage, completed the lawyer. The climate modification company failed to prevent the natural rain. Ironically, your faith defeated his technology. But why are you showing us this? Gatton asked Wayne. If we have proof he cheated, we can use it to our advantage. We can and we will, but there's a problem. I obtained these documents in a, let's say, ethically questionable way. As a former employee, I shouldn't have had access to them after being fired. Does that mean we can't use the evidence? It means we need a smart strategy to make this information useful without legally compromising me. Attorney Marshall explained that it would be necessary to find a way to get the authorities to investigate Silas on their own, reaching the same conclusions through official channels. We need to report his practices to the district attorney's office, but in a way that the investigation seems to have arisen naturally from your complaints. And how do we do that? First, we document all the strange incidents that happened on your properties. Broken equipment, dry wells, sudden pests. Second, we've managed to get witnesses from his employees who might have seen something suspicious. Silas's employees will never speak against him, said John pessimistically. Maybe some will, if they know they won't be alone. I know some former employees who were fired for refusing to do questionable things. The meeting stretched into the evening, with everyone contributing information and planning the next steps. For the first time since her troubles began, Esther felt there was a real possibility of not only saving her property, but also achieving justice. When everyone had left, she remained alone on the porch, looking at the starry sky. The rain from 2 weeks ago had truly been a miracle, but now she was discovering that sometimes miracles need to be defended with the same earthly tools that tried to destroy them. During the following days, the group of small farmers organized themselves methodically. Each was responsible for documenting the specific problems they had faced, including dates, times, and any available physical evidence. Esther rediscovered organizational skills she hadn't used since the days she helped her husband with the farm's bookkeeping. She created a detailed timeline of all the strange events that had occurred on her property over the past 2 years. The first important discovery came from Charles Owens. He had kept the water pump that mysteriously broke 6 months earlier, and an independent mechanic confirmed there was evidence of intentional sabotage. The shaft was almost completely sawed through, leaving just a small part so the pump would work for a few hours before breaking for good, the mechanic explained to Attorney Marshall. And this couldn't have been natural wear. Impossible. The saw marks are visible. Someone did this on purpose. The second piece of evidence came from Mary Sanders. She had photographed her artesian well before and after the alleged drying up, and the images showed signs of recent digging around the source. It looks like someone diverted the course of the underground water, concluded a water resources technician consulted by Attorney Marshall. But the most important discovery came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Pearl, an 80-year-old woman who lived in a small house between Esther's and Silas's properties, sought out Wayne one morning with information she had kept to herself for months. "Son," she said, gripping Wayne's arm with surprising strength for her age, "I've seen strange things happening around here in the early morning hours." "What kind of things, Mrs. Pearl?" "Men in dark uniforms tampering with the neighbors' fences. I thought they were thieves, but they didn't take anything. They just messed with the equipment." "Would you be able to recognize these men?" "Not their faces because of the dark, but I recognize the pickup truck they used. It's the same one Silas's foreman drives." Mrs. Pearl had noted the dates and times of these events in a recipe notebook, mixed in among cake recipes and home remedies. Her detailed memory and observational skills made her the most valuable witness the group could have. "Why didn't you tell this before, Mrs. Pearl?" Who would believe an 80-year-old woman talking about things she saw in the dark? But now that you're investigating, I thought it might be important. With this evidence in hand, Attorney Marshall prepared a formal complaint to the district attorney's office. The document did not mention the papers he had obtained illegally, but it presented such a clear pattern of sabotage and manipulation that an official investigation would be almost inevitable. "The prosecutor will want to hear from you personally," he explained to the group. "Get ready to tell your stories in full detail, but without mentioning our meeting about the internal documents." The official investigation began 3 weeks after the complaint. District Attorney Paul Henry Sanders was a young man recently transferred from Chicago who had requested to work in the county to be closer to cases that truly impacted people's lives. The first interrogation was with Esther. She told her story simply and directly, from the difficulties with the drought to the desperate bet and the subsequent discovery of the manipulations. "Do you truly believe your prayer made it rain?" asked the prosecutor, not ironically, but with genuine curiosity. "Yes, I do, attorney, but I also believe God acts through people, And now I'm seeing that perhaps he used the natural rain to expose the wickedness that was happening here. Esther's answer impressed the prosecutor, who had expected to find a superstitious and naive lady, but instead encountered an intelligent and insightful woman who perfectly understood the complexity of her situation. The interrogations with the other small farmers confirmed a systematic pattern of sabotage, followed by low-ball purchase offers. The physical evidence, mainly the sabotaged water pump and the alterations to the artesian well, provided a technical basis for the charges. Mrs. Pearl's testimony was the most impactful. Her detailed memory and chronological notes created a precise map of the suspicious activities that had occurred in the county over the last 2 years. "Are you certain it was the foreman's pickup truck from Mr. Blackstone?" "Absolutely. I've known that pickup for 15 years. It's a blue Toyota with a scratch on the right side that the driver made on a barbed wire fence." The prosecutor sent an investigative team to verify the pickup truck mentioned by Mrs. Pearl. The vehicle was found exactly as she described, and technical examinations confirmed the presence of tools compatible with the types of sabotage reported by the small farmers. As the official investigation progressed, Silas Blackstone began to show signs of nervousness. He cancelled several social engagements and started moving around, always accompanied by private security, claiming to have received anonymous threats. The situation became even more complicated when 2 former employees of Silas approached the prosecutor voluntarily. They had been fired months earlier for refusing to participate in activities they considered questionable. "He had us break equipment in the dead of night," said one of them, a 50-year-old man named Frank. "He said it was to help the neighbors understand they had no future in farming." "And you did that?" "At first we thought it was just to scare them, to force some quick sales. But when he ordered us to block Mrs. Esther's water spring, I said that was too much. That's when he fired me." The second former employee, Jim, had even more specific information. "He hired a company from Chicago to do something with the clouds. They arrived here on the eve of that bet, but it seems something went wrong. Silas was furious when it rained anyway. These revelations confirmed everything Attorney Marshall had discovered in the documents, but now through official and legally valid sources. The prosecutor had enough material for a formal indictment. The preventive arrest of Silas Blackstone was ordered on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after the rain that saved Esther's farm. The charges included criminal conspiracy, aggravated property damage, extortion, and fraud against small farmers. The news spread through the county like wildfire. Many people who had been intimidated by Silas for years finally felt free to tell their own stories of power abuse and manipulation. Esther was working in her vegetable garden when Wayne arrived with the news of the arrest. She stopped weeding and stood in silence for a few minutes, processing the information. "How do I feel?" she said, anticipating Wayne's question. "I feel relief, but not joy. Seeing anyone go to jail doesn't make me happy, even if it's someone who tried to destroy me." "And now?" "Now life goes on. I have a farm to run and a family to bring back together." The family, in fact, was coming together in a way Esther hadn't expected. Heather had decided to move back to the countryside, bringing Wayne and the small accounting firm they had built in the city. "We want to help other small producers get better organized financially," explained Heather. "What happened with Silas showed that a lot of problems could have been avoided with better planning and mutual support." Esther's property became an informal organizing center for small producers in the county. Attorney Marshall opened an office in the neighboring town, specializing in agricultural law and the defense of small rural properties. 6 months after Silas's arrest, the properties he had acquired under questionable circumstances were returned to their original owners or sold at fair prices to new producers. The recovered money was used to create a support fund for small farmers facing temporary hardship. Esther's farm prospered beyond her most optimistic expectations. The combination of the land renewed by the rain, her traditional knowledge, and the modern techniques brought by Heather and Wayne created a model farming operation for the county, but the most important transformation happened in family relationships. Esther discovered that her stubbornness, which she had always considered a flaw, was actually a form of persistence that inspired other people not to give up on their dreams. Heather discovered that her rural roots were not an obstacle to her modern life, but rather a source of strength and authenticity that enriched everything she did. Wayne found in farming a passion he never knew existed. He specialized in sustainable irrigation systems and began helping other producers optimize their water use. One year after the famous bet, the county organized a community celebration on the exact anniversary of the miraculous rain. Esther was invited to speak to hundreds of people who had come from various neighboring towns. "I didn't come here to talk about miracles," she told the crowd. "I came to talk about persistence, about not bowing your head when things get tough, about trusting that there's always a solution even when you can't see it. The rain that saved my farm may have been a miracle, but the struggle that saved our community was the work of ordinary people doing the right thing. And that is within reach for all of us every single day." Esther's speech received a standing ovation. Many people cried, remembering their own struggles and victories. Others felt inspired to face challenges they had been putting off for years. Attorney Marshall, who was in the audience with his family, reflected on how his life had changed since he decided to do what was right instead of what was convenient. He had lost the well-paying job and the high-end pickup truck, but he had gained something far more valuable: self-respect and the gratitude of an entire community. After the celebration, Esther returned to her farm accompanied by her family. They sat on the porch where so many important meetings had taken place, watching the sunset paint the sky with the same orange hues as a year before. "Mom," said Heather, breaking the comfortable silence, "I never asked you. Did you really believe it was going to rain when you made that bet?" Esther smiled, the same smile that had sustained her through all the difficult times. "My dear, when a person has nothing left to lose, faith stops being a choice and becomes a necessity. I needed to believe it would rain because it was the only hope I had left. And now, do you still have faith in the same way?" "Now, my faith is different. It's no longer desperation disguised as hope. It's gratitude transformed into confidence that, no matter what comes, we'll find a way to overcome it together." Wayne got up to check the irrigation system he had recently installed. The plants sprouting under the soft evening light represented much more than a successful crop. They symbolized the renewal of a family, of a community, and of faith in the possibility that right things prevail over wrong ones. As she watched her son-in-law tend to the land with the same care she always had, Esther thought of her late husband. Arthur would be proud to see that the farm not only survived, but became a symbol of resilience and hope for the entire county. Night fell gently over the property, bringing with it the familiar sound of crickets and the scent of damp earth that was now watered by a modern system instead of relying solely on luck with the weather. Esther went inside and walked to the room where she kept her most precious memories. On the nightstand beside the bed was a photo of her family gathered at the community celebration. It was an image that perfectly captured the most important lesson she had learned. Sometimes, losing everything is the only way to discover what truly matters. Before sleeping, she said her daily prayer, but it was no longer a desperate plea for help. It was a grateful conversation with the force that had guided not only the miraculous rain but every step that came after it. Outside, the plants grew silently under the starry sky, in a land that was almost lost, but now represented the ultimate victory of persistence over greed, of community over individualism, and of faith over despair. End of story. So, what did you think of this moving story? Tell us in the comments if you've ever been through a difficult situation that only faith could resolve. Do you think Mrs. Esther made the right decision by making that risky bet? Which part of the story moved you the most? Leave your honest opinion below. We love reading every one of your comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one.